the 101, we're going to talk about what are the main use cases for Kumu. There are two main ones, and I'll go over each one. Key differences between personal organization accounts. I'm going to breeze through that stuff just to make sure that there's no confusion on that. How to get started in Kumu once you have an account. And we're going to probably spend maybe the bulk of the time doing that kind of stuff. And then at the end, I'll touch on where you can go to learn more, where you can go for help if you get stuck. And then with any luck, we'll have maybe 10, 15 minutes for just open Q&A. We can do questions about the 101 material, or if it seems like people just have questions on their specific projects, stuff they're trying to achieve, I'm happy to go deep in any direction, as long as it feels like we have time. So yeah, so I'll jump into the main use cases, which are system mapping and network mapping. You'll see that I have two guides pulled up here. And these are kind of our overview guides on these two disciplines. A lot of stuff falls under these two umbrellas, and these two umbrellas also go by different names for a lot of people. So I try to let the pictures speak for themselves more often than the words, because the pictures is where the rubber really hits the road. Like you can call a system map a causal loop diagram, or sometimes people will see system map and think it's about ecosystem mapping, which is more, I would say, like stakeholder mapping, which more falls into the camp of network mapping. So we can get so tied up with the vocabulary that I usually like to just jump into the pictures as soon as possible. But in general, a system map, the way I think about it, is a really complicated flow chart that can loop back on itself rather than just traveling from left to right and having a defined starting and ending point. It might start and end in a specific spot, but if it does, it definitely takes you a while to get there, and you can get trapped in loops along the way of causality. Then network mapping is more about like free form, maybe larger data sets, probably collected with a survey often. But the idea is that you draw a circle to represent every person, organization, and network, and then draw a line to represent the relationships between them. And if you're doing stakeholder or ecosystem mapping, you might have metadata, like what industry people work in, and you can draw connections in Kumu based on that information as well. Kind of like, they wouldn't be direct personal connections, they would be more inferred connection that you can think these two people have some sort of meta relationship because they work in the same industry, therefore they probably follow the same publications, they probably have similar skill sets. So in some sense, they are, related to each other. So jumping into the pictures, like I said, I think makes it a lot clearer. This is our kind of seminal example of a system map. This is completely not linear at all. This is actually maybe on the other end of the spectrum of being almost a perfect circle, with lots of interconnected loops flowing in and out. And again, it is a spectrum, so you can have a system map that does start maybe somewhere over here and end somewhere over here. Might have a lot of this activity going on in between, with loops that you can get trapped in. I won't dive into too much of reading these, but you can see these arrows, you can get stuck in here following that in a circle. So even if you had a starting and ending point, it wouldn't necessarily be a smooth path to get there. So that in general, that's what a system map looks like, usually 10, 20-ish circles. You can have more or less than that, certainly, but that's, I think, what I see most often. And then a network map is something more like this. Takes a little longer to dive into it because you can get pretty tangled up here in the center when you have a lot of different personal relationships connecting people. But in this one, every circle is an organization and the lines are relationships between them. All this data was collected with a survey. I did not build this by hand. That would have been excruciating. So those are the basics of the disciplines. And I think I won't spend too much more time on either of those other than maybe just to ask. You can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and let me know what you find yourself working more with. And if we have a strong leaning in one direction, I can probably tailor the rest of it to talk mostly about that stuff. So between system and network mapping, do you guys think that you work on one of those more than any other?
I'd say systems for me.
I would say exclusively systems for myself.
Mhm.
Me too.
My focus is on social systems right now, but systems maps in the past.
I am very happy to do either.
Cool.
I'll be the person that says that I work on network more, but a little bit on systems too.
That's where I've been in the past too. I've done mostly network in my own personal projects and a little bit of systems.
Yeah, I have a question in regards to the difference between systems maps and network maps. It's mostly the layout, because I think you can also have the network analysis metrics on the systems map, no? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you definitely can. Yeah, the metrics really are just looking at circles and lines. They're not concerned about whether this is categorized as a system or categorized as a network. So you can use, yeah, those metrics all come from the field of network science, but definitely a lot of that is useful in system science too.
So the main difference between those two is the layout, in essence.
I think the main difference is what the circles and lines represent. The layout is definitely, there's definitely a divide where system maps often will have this fixed layout and the network maps will have a floating layout like this. But usually I think that's not because of you know, any inherent need to do that. I've made system maps that are floating and I've made network maps that are fixed. But usually with a network map, you're working with a slightly larger data set and it's just tedious to find your own positions manually for everything. So people tend to just go with this floating layout for ease of use and ease of building it. And the readability isn't affected all that much. A system, it's much more often that you're really trying to tell a structured story. So you might be able to unpin everything here and just let it float around. It could be interesting to see where things get pulled into in terms of their positions. But if you're telling a structured story, you're going to want that to be more predictable. So you want to know every time you reload this map, everything's in the exact same spot. But yeah, with a systems map, these are usually not people or organizations, they're factors in a system. So I can actually dive into maybe one of these loops and we'll see. So this represents member party responsiveness to intense policy demanders versus broader constituencies. So maybe like, you know, the amount of congressperson would listen to an individual lobbyist versus, you know, go to a town hall meeting and listen to 200 people weigh in on something. So this responsiveness affects the citizens, that citizens perceive a gap between the focus of Congress and the common good. So this element, I think, yeah, maybe represents that Congress people pay more attention to intense policy demanders and don't pay as much attention to broader constituencies. So the effect of that factor is that we see this other factor evolve or emerge. So these two represent factors in the system, and this line represents a causal relationship. Maybe like you can read that as increases, it's often done. So if we read that here, citizens perceive gap, this factor increases broadly representative problem-solving candidates and parties. Because if citizens perceive that gap between the focus of Congress and common good, they just won't vote for that person anymore. They'll find somebody else who would focus on the common good. So you can, you know, if this factor gets strong enough, it will increase the amount of candidates that actually solve problems and listen to what the majority of their constituents want. So, you know, it takes definitely a lot longer. I think in a system, that's maybe another indication. If it takes you, you know, a minute or two just to explain these two simple relationships, whereas here it's like, oh, this person has a relationship to this one and they have a personal relationship to that one. It takes me all of 5 seconds to explain that. If this were a system map, it would take me a lot longer to kind of zoom in, figure out what is this trying to say, what does this relationship mean? And that's also typically why you would see these maps be a lot smaller, because there's just so much more information packed into a small space.
Gotcha, thank you. And just a follow-up question on something you mentioned. So you said if you unpin this, you would be interested to see how they will get pulled. I was always curious about how elements in a Kumu map are brought together and what are the pulling and pushing forces.
Yeah.
How's that done?
Yeah, there's three main forces. Hidden kind of somewhere in here, although you can't really see it or tell where it is, there's kind of a center, a true center of the map. And there's a gravity force that pulls everything toward that true center. So for example, this, if there were no gravity force, this thing might just like continue floating off the screen out there. But since we have that gravity force, let's see if I can get it to come back. Yeah, it'll get pulled back into the center like that. That's force number one. Force number two is that these circles repel each other as if they were the same end of a magnet. So they don't like to be next to each other, and they'll push away from each other. And that's, you know, that's basically the two, when these unconnected elements, that's what they're fighting against. The gravity is pulling them back, but they also don't want to be close to any of these. They want to get as far away as possible. So they just kind of find somewhere in the middle that balances out. And then the connections pull things together. So these two, if I were to delete this connection, well, maybe I can do that right now. Just undo it afterward. I'll get rid of that, and you can see those like then push each other apart, because they are pushing each other apart all the time, but the connection pulls them back together. And I should undo that change.
Oh, thank you.
So those three forces, multiply that by 100, 200, however many circles you have and however many lines you have, and you get these unique shapes.
So when you're making a map and you want a visual, you know, an attractive visual representation, do you just play with those three parameters? Are there guidelines about using them,
Yeah.
or is it just play with it until it looks right?
Yeah, it is. You can definitely play with it until it looks right. Often I won't get to the point where I'm actually, you can, you know, manipulate the exact number of values. You can say like the gravity of the layout is this number, it's this strong, or you can reduce that or increase it. I often don't get that far. I think on this one, I just applied a preset. If I go into more options here and customize view defaults, yeah, it just has the hairball preset. And so that just kind of like lowers the gravity, I think increases the amount of repelling between circles, and then maybe decreases the connection strength a little bit. But everything starts with auto. So on this map, auto is, yeah, like pretty much unreadable. So I just went for hairball. If I wanted to customize that a little more, there are ways that you can do that from the advanced editor.
What determines gravity center?
There's just kind of like behind the scenes here, there's just like a X and Y axis grid going on, and every, like in this one, behind these all actually have a saved X and Y coordinate that you could see if you were to download, like I don't own that one, so I can't do that. But if you were to download the JSON file, you could see that they actually all do have an X and Y position saved in here if you're using the fixed layout. And so, yeah, there's just like a 0, 0, X, Y origin point somewhere in the background here.
So whatever
And
you
this
put
map-
into, whatever
Yeah,
you
go
put
ahead.
into that coordinates is what's going to be the gravity. So you have to be really careful about what you decide is going to be the center of your map, it seems.
Well, the center of the map is just decided for you. There's just like the Kumu canvas, and it has
Okay.
its own center. This one, you know, I mean, when you first open up a new map, it will, you know, 0, 0 will be perfectly centered on your screen. It doesn't really matter where that is. This could, you know, maybe we're at like -1000 X and 2000 Y with this element, who knows? But since these are all fixed, it doesn't matter because they're not going to move anywhere. They're not going to be, there's no gravity force acting on them because they're pinned in place. So it's really, you know, only relevant when you're using a floating layout like this. And if you are doing that, it will, well, actually, I can show you actually another scenario where it would be relevant. And we can find true center here. So I'm going to use this little feature called snap to circle. And so you see these all snap to circle, and it shows as the center of that circle, just like the geometric center between all of those. So if I scroll this out a little bit, increase the diameter, and then I go over here and click snap to center, that's going to bring the center of the circle to wherever the true center of the map is, which is right there. So that's kind of an interesting way. If you're ever curious exactly where it is, you can use that snap to trick and then snap to center to find it. But yeah, again, if you're working with a force directed map, you're always pretty much going to be working in the vicinity because gravity is just going to pull everything back towards it.
Where did you get the snap to circle drop down?
That one is, you just have to have any number of elements selected, and then you right click on the background of the map and click snap to circle or snap to line. And you can do, I think, like, yeah, you can rotate these lines. do some pretty cool stuff with this.
How are you rotating it?
Rotate with shift.
Oh, I see.
Scroll up and down. Yeah. So for each of them, they have those little instructions. For a line, it's shift and scroll. To rotate, I don't think there's an equivalent shift and scroll with circle. Maybe there is. Yeah, no, there's just scroll up and down to resize. I wonder.
And that works with any map template?
Any map, yeah. And then when you save these positions, these would actually get pinned in place. And I can do that right now, actually. I just hit enter. Oh, maybe I think I'm feeding this map from a Google Sheet or something, so I won't be able to save positions. But yeah, you can, so I guess that's a good point to bring up. If you're importing, if you have like a Google Sheets connected map, which maybe doesn't mean anything to some of you, but there is a way to do that. You can't save positions with those maps. You always have to use the floating layout. So you can't use Snap 2 with those. But this map, definitely, if I wanted to, that's not the layout of this one. But I could just select any number of elements. Doesn't matter whether your system, you know, what template you're using, what category of map you're working with, you always have that feature available.
For the snap to line, does that work with elements that have a fixed position?
Yes, yeah, it works both with fixed and floating.
Okay.
With floating elements, if you select a bunch of, like if I selected these, and I think we are, yeah, I don't know, I can't save position.
I asked because I've tried it with a stock, like when I use stock and flow diagrams, so I'll have a stock and flow, and I'm trying to line up the elements perfectly because manually it can take a lot of time.
Totally, yeah.
Whenever I try and do it with snap to line, my elements, everything disappears. I'm not using a mouse though, I'm using a trackpad. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but I've never been able to make that work properly, so.
Huh, weird. Yeah, okay. If you can send, I'd actually love to take a look at that. If you can send a link to the map to support at kumu.io, I'll play around with one and see if I can recreate it, figure out what's going on.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, that's a little bit about layout and disciplines. But yeah, as we're kind of finding out here, most of the difference, the biggest difference between these is visual, but there's also some significant differences in the content. I actually do have a good guide somewhere in here. Kumu's architecture guide, which is kind of like a vocabulary dictionary is the way I imagine this guide being, just explaining what everything is visually and what it actually means. And there's a table here that I put together of all kinds of different maps that you could create and what you could use the circles and lines to represent. I've done, you know, I think maybe I can pull up. Yeah, I've done some silly stuff for sure, using elements to represent some silly things. Really, at the end of the day, it's just circles and lines and sometimes squares if you want. So if you can envision in your head something that would use those visual elements and make a meaningful map, you can do it. The key always is just explaining to your audience clearly what all the circles represent and what the lines represent so that they can follow along with you. Okay, so if there are any other questions on use cases, I can tackle those now because I think it's important to have that stuff pretty clear. Otherwise, I can
Alex,
move forward. Yep.
could you link in the previous session videos on this landing page?
Might not do it on this. Yeah, maybe we can do it down below here somewhere. We don't have a lot of flexibility with like the tool that we use to build this thing, but hopefully we can figure something out.
Okay.
That's my goal. I think by the end of the week, I'd like to have at least a couple of them uploaded. We've done what, maybe 4 or 5 different webinars this year. And so, yeah, I think we'll just get those up on our YouTube channel. And then what I was thinking is we have in the docs, this, where is it? This quick tips page where it's really just the entire page is just this embedded playlist. So I'll probably do the same thing where I'll add a webinars page and it'll just be embedded playlist of all of our webinars. And so that would be at docs.kumu.io/getting-started/webinars whenever that's available. And then, yeah, maybe we'll just keep this one for like hosting descriptions of upcoming webinars. But yeah, so to get started with Kumu, you need an account. And the way that works briefly is that everybody in Kumu, every individual real human being gets their own personal account. And if you're working with a team of people, usually like 3 people or more, we advise that you then create an organization. So all of the people on your team would have a personal account. It would be free for limited public projects. And then you would then create an organization account where you could host your projects under. So this isn't like a clean, like a straight upgrade path where like you start with a personal and you upgrade your personal to an organization. It's more like everybody gets a personal, and then you can use all your personal accounts to form an organization together if you want. But anyway, that's the main point, is that you have to have some sort of account, and then you can create a new project. So here I'm just going to create one called Kumu 101. Clearly, I have done this before. I'll leave it public, and I'll just create it from here. And I'm also just following along, by the way, for this first steps guide. I'm just kind of working through the steps here. My next step here, once this loads up, is going to be to pick a template. We have these 4 available. Well, I guess these 3, and this one is just kind of like not a template. It's just the absence of any default settings. These 3 all have their own default settings. The main thing to know is that you're not locked in. You can switch templates at any time. We have an interface for that, or you can actually just use the advanced editor to switch them, or even undo all of the default settings that are in these. So there's nothing special about them. You're not locked in. They're really just collections of default settings to make your map look a certain way. So I'm going to go to the systems template for now. And now that I'm in, I can start adding stuff. So I may not be building a system map here. I'm probably just going to be mapping nonsense, but I'll just go with the system template for the way that it looks. So to get started, I'm going to add a circle, an element here. Can add another one. And then I can add a connection between them. So you see if I have this one selected actually on the screen, it fills that in for me. If I have nothing selected here, nothing selected on the map, then it will prompt me to fill in both names. And you can drag these, move these around. These are pinned right now. The system map starts you off with the fixed layout by default, because that's the most often people use. And you can always check by looking down here in the profile if something is pinned. It's going to have blue right there. I can unpin it, and then I think if I, yeah. So this is now floating around. You see it does actually get nested pretty close up to there. That's just because the circle size is big. So bigger circles don't necessarily push away from each other with more force. It's the same amount of force. So if you make these bigger, they'll just start overlapping eventually. But I am going to keep this pinned and start structuring those. And then, so that's like kind of the main, you know, the traditional interface for adding stuff to a map. You can also import data, which I can touch on later if we have time or if people are interested in seeing that work. You can also, if you're building a system map, you can use this sketch feature, which I prefer when I'm building these kind of smaller maps that have fixed positions and I have kind of a shape that I'm trying to draw them into. So I'm just clicking and dragging here to draw connections, and you can also just click out into space to add more stuff. And then also when you have connections between any 2 elements, if both of these elements are pinned in place, you'll be able to click and drag this to change its curvature. And so using that process, just doing that a bunch of times, is how they eventually built up a map like this. These are all pinned in place, and then you can see all these curvatures have been kind of manually adjusted to get the map into a shape that's readable, you know, pretty still complex, but not overwhelming. Definitely less overwhelming than it would be if all of these had their default curvature, because they'd be all crisscrossing over each other and you'd lose track of where things go and where they come from. But so that's the basics of how to build a map in Kumu. And again, there are kind of three main ways to do this. Building by hand, which is what I just did. That includes both just anything that you do with this green plus button, we consider that building by hand, whether you're doing this add element, add connection, add loop thing. I can show actually how adding a loop works. A loop is just a group of 2 or more connections. So I'm going to replace the label in the center of all of them. Or if you're using the sketch tool, that's also considered building by hand. Importing a spreadsheet is another way to build maps. That's how I built this one here. And you can also sync to a Google Sheet or technically just like a remote JSON blueprint, which is a much more technical thing that I won't dive into now. But essentially these two, if you're building by hand or importing a spreadsheet, an Excel or a CSV, or even, like an Excel downloaded from Google Sheets, with these two, you can use the fixed layout or the floating layout, whichever you choose. If you're syncing to a Google Sheet, it's going to pull, it's not really actually saving any data to the map itself. If you're doing that, it's pulling it new from Google Sheets every single time. So the kind of bad side effect is that we can't save positions for each circle because they aren't actually saved into the map itself. They're just refreshed every time you reload the page. So with Google Sheets, you can only use the floating layout. So Google Sheets, we most often see people use. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody use it for a system map, although I'm sure somebody out there has. But definitely for network maps, it's a pretty common way. Just because there's a lot more like repetitive data entry to be doing with those, more structured, rows and columns kind of stuff that you're trying to collect, and easier for people, a group of people often, to work adding those into a spreadsheet, which is a format that everyone's familiar with, rather than relying on a group of maybe 10 people to learn the Kumu interface itself and be able to come in here and add stuff and do that same data entry, or even come in here to table. This is definitely a little bit more approachable for people that are familiar with spreadsheets, but not at all with Kumu. But even so, I think of the table as more useful often for just viewing stuff, because I find anytime I'm working with a spreadsheet and importing stuff into Kumu, it's just a matter of time before I find myself needing some sort of spreadsheet formula to just make my work faster, make my data entry or formatting faster. And this isn't like a full-on spreadsheets tool, so we don't support spreadsheet formulas in here. So some people do use this for editing and input. It's definitely fine. It's great for simple use cases, but I often prefer to stick to just a spreadsheet so that I have that Excel function firepower if I ever need it. Question from Danilo in the chat. So why, when we import data from a spreadsheet, we can't pin elements on the map? If you're importing just directly from Excel, you definitely can. But if you are syncing to a Google Sheets, I'm trying to think if I have a good example off the top of my head that does that. I don't know if I can think of one. But basically, when you're importing, when you're linked to a Google Sheet, so if I look in here and I exported the JSON or the Excel, I would have a bunch of data in there. Basically, when I add stuff to this map, it goes to your Kumu database and it gets stored in there. If you're importing from Google Sheets, your project doesn't put anything into its own database behind the scenes. It just pulls it from Google Sheets new every single time the page is reloaded. And that's how we have to do that in order to capture any new data that's been added since the last time the page was reloaded to the Google Sheet. And so since the project isn't storing any of this data in its own database, that means that the side effect is that it can't attach positions to these because there's nothing in the database, so there's nothing to attach positions to, those X and Y coordinates that we store behind the scenes just to recreate layouts like this. So this one not being created from Google Sheets, all of these elements and connections have been added to the Hewlett Foundation Madison Initiative, the database behind this project that powers this. And so since all of this is in the database, it can store X and Y coordinates for them. But with a Google Sheet, we never store stuff in the database. It all just lives in Google Sheets. So that's kind of the maybe slightly technical reason why we can't save positions. Can you cut and paste into the Kumu table? Yes, I believe you can. But most of them, you know, when you click on them to edit, they don't bring up just like a standard. They don't just like, you know, do what Excel would do, which is it just puts your cursor in the box. They bring up these other, you know, these editing boxes, and you can see each one of these are different. That's because these fields have different types. Like this one can hold more than one value, so it brings up just an autocomplete thing where I can add different tags, tag 1, tag 2, and then I can remove if I see fit. This one is like a pick from a list of options. So if I do like person, or I can do company. So yes, you can copy paste, but you would be copy pasting into one of these things. And maybe what you're asking is more about, can you copy paste like a range of data? So that you can't do because you have to edit each one of these individually like this by opening up these edit boxes. So yeah, I guess that's another important drawback, and another reason why I don't often use this thing for editing, and I use it more for viewing, is because I'm doing that all the time. I copy, you know, pasting like B2 to G36 or whatever. I just want that entire range. I want to move it somewhere else. You can't do that with this table tool. So question from Danilo, can I add a new column on my Google Sheet to attach positions? Yes, you totally could. I've done that in the past. I've done some pretty crazy visual stuff with that. I wonder, let's see, just I wonder if this will pop up in Google for me. Not Google, DuckDuckGo. Maybe Kumu. Search. Let's see what happens here. I think this is the one. But what I'm getting at here is, yes, you can add columns. The process would be you add columns in your Google Sheet, you put in your X and Y positions, and then you're going to use something called the scatter plot layout in Kumu. And if you go look up this guide, it will show you how to, you know, basically tell Kumu to use your columns from your spreadsheet as X and Y coordinates. That's what this one has done behind the scenes. I think the fields are hidden from view here, but inside, you know, this is coming from Google Sheet, this map, and each of these have X and Y positions, and they are, you know, in this perfect kind of triangular shape because it was calculated that way by the spreadsheet. All the X and Y positions were just computed in there, and then you can link that up. And this is using Google Sheets, but it is kind of in this structured format because it's using that scatter layout. I can probably show behind these scenes. Yeah, so layout scatter. That's, you know, if you see this layout scatter anywhere in somebody's settings, they're using scatter plot layout. And there's some other syntax here that you can read through the guide to figure out how to use. So yeah, that is the workaround to creating what looks like a fixed layout. It's technically not a fixed layout, but it does look like one, even though you're coming from Google Sheet. So question from Gene, in the custom template is where you find the options for causal loop diagrams and stock flow diagrams. Yeah, I think actually in any template you can find those. So what am I in? I'm in the systems template now. But if I just come into, I'm in the editor here, basic editor, settings button, basic editor, more options, customize view defaults, and then down here in the template picker, I can pick from any of those. So stock and flow and causal loop are in there. Yeah, so we just show, off the bat, we just show systems, stakeholder, and social network analysis, because those are the most common that people need and use. And then we have that other, just in case people want to start with none. But there are other ones in here, like radar is a pretty cool one that starts you off with this radar thing. And you can kind of move stuff around in here. This is, I think, the newest one. There's some other cool stuff in here. Geo is like an actual geographic map, and you can plot by latitude and longitude on there. Question from Danilo, the title of the column. You Yeah, there's no required title. You can have any title, but yeah, to figure out how all of that works and how to like tell Kumu, definitely go check out this guide because it's kind of like a long, involved process in the advanced editor, and it's different from every project for sure. And by the way, switching templates, there is a guide on that too. I kind of raced through it just now, but in docs.kumu.io/guides/templates, it's at the bottom here of the general doc on templates. So if you come find this one and scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see those instructions that I just went through on switching between them. And yeah, you can switch at any time. Some of them, just note that some of them do add different field values. So if I come in here and I come into connection type, I've got all these, these field values were all added by the system template. The stakeholder template adds some element type values. If you ever don't want any of this stuff, you can just come in here and get rid of it. So if you're switching between a bunch of different templates, you might end up with like all of the field values for all of them, even though you might be using none of them. So just know that you can always get rid of those. And so that covers templates and I think building by hand pretty well. I think we can move on to talking about decorations, and maybe I can spend a little bit more time on views, because that would be maybe what I'd cover in like the next stage webinar after this one. But in Kumu for decorating, these are all just green by default. If I wanted them to be different colors, there's no kind of concept, at least not yet. Maybe some point in the future there will be, but there's no concept in Kumu of you grab the paint can, you click blue, and then you click on the circle with the paint can to make it blue, which is typically how you would expect a visual tool like this to work. But in Kumu, all of that stuff is data driven. So if I come in here and I open up the profile, this is kind of like just my bucket where I store all the data. Or if you're looking at a spreadsheet, these are stored in rows and columns. So it would be like, row 1 would have the headers. This would be label, type, description, tags, and then any, custom field that you add. And then in row 1, under label, it would say fourth element. Under my custom field column, it would say custom value or whatever I want to put in there. And then you can use this data in Kumu to drive your decorations. So I'll just do a quick color by, and I'll color by that custom field thing that I just created. So 2 things to notice. 1, these are all gray. That's because they don't have anything in their custom field, so they just get no color, the default gray. This one is blue because it has that value, and also that is indicated in the legend. So if I add a different value here, I get, the colors kind of readjust themselves, and I start getting some different colors on the map. If I add the same, I think I'll get prompted actually, maybe. No, not yet. Oh yeah, I do. Different value. Those ones will now be the same color, and if I add that one, these 2 should be the same color. So if you're just trying to color one element, you could come in and do something like, decorate elements, whatever. And then decorate my selected, decorate custom selection, and you would do like label is fourth element. And I'm just showing this, I'm breezing through this just to show that it is like a little bit complex. If you just want to color one element, one color, which is easy if you have a paint can, it's a little bit complex in Kumu because of the way that we do data-driven decorations. But if you have 100 of these and you want to color all of them, it's going to be quite a bit faster to do it with that kind of thing. So this one, basically I set up this rule that says any element that has the label fourth element, just color purple. If I have 100 elements all labeled fourth element, then it would be a lot faster for me to just set up that rule, and Kumu will apply it to all of them, and it saves me the trouble of having to click a paint can 100 times. So tedious in some instances if you know you're doing like really pinpointed decorations, but really, really, really powerful in other instances. For example, in here, where all of these are colored based on the tags that they have inside of them. So I think we won't show up, but this color by thing is set to the tags field. And that's just coloring all of these at once. It's looking at every tag, and because these all have tags in their profile, and it's checking, you know, if it has a certain tag, it will add the appropriate color to indicate that that tag is there. Otherwise, it will leave a gap between those colored arcs. So stuff like this, like imagine having to do that, you know, with some sort of like flag tool where you say like, oh, it has this tag, so I'm going to add the orange flag. That would be just excruciating to do for all of this data. But since we have that data-driven decoration philosophy at Kumu, it was as simple as just me saying color by tags. Super short process, and I got, you know, the full map decorated all in one go. I got some questions in the chat here, so I'm going to check those out. Question from Jim about Geo Maps. Unambiguous location info. Yeah, beyond X, Y, or like latitude, longitude coordinates. Yeah, so the way to really make sure, what am I going to go to templates/geo.
I've just had a lot of weird stuff happen.
Oh, totally. Yeah, me too. Yeah. So the thing that is really useful, the trick that's useful to know is right in here. This line right here. So you always have to set up, I imagine you maybe have set up your geolocation. You might be using the location field, which is what it looks for by default. But if you're using a different field like zip code, you know, you can say geolocation, Kumu, look at the zip code field and place everything by that. If you want to scope that, like if you just have a street address and you don't have a zip code, but you know everything's in the USA or everything's in Africa or something like that, you can use this format where you say, okay, for geolocation, Kumu.
Yeah, the problem's been with global places where people have different systems, postal code, zip code.
Yeah,
it's not one country.
Yeah, yeah. So I think yeah, if you were doing this all in one go, trying to get it all in one country or all in one location, you would just add like comma and then scope it like USA, or this one will place everything in Hawaii. But in your data set, you can do the same thing where you just add, you know, comma Africa at the end, or comma Germany or whatever. And that usually has solved the problem for me in the past. If that doesn't work for you, then I can definitely take a look at your specific data and see if I can come up with anything else. But typically, if you have like a street address and then a comma and then the country, even if that's not, you know, coming from this fancy automatic Kumu setting, if that's just worked into your data set, that is usually enough to clear up pretty much all the errors. In any map where I've had errors, that was able to clear it up.
So if people if they're putting this data in themselves, they could put a specific thing, zip code, postal, or street address or whatever, but as long as they put comma country, that it should resolve.
That should resolve, yeah. And then also you can, if you have some way of knowing what country they're from or what country that address is supposed to be in. I've also done stuff in the past. Well, yeah, in that case, no. But I have in the past, there have been situations where I knew what country the address they were putting was in. And so I just did that with Excel formulas. I just added automatically the like comma Africa or whatever. Save them the trouble, make sure that I don't get any typos back from them and have to clean that up. But yeah, if it's just a free form data input, then yeah, you can add maybe some instructions on there to always end with comma country, and that should help a lot.
Thanks.
Is it possible to have a node shift colors depending on the view? Yeah, definitely. That's kind of a newer feature that you can do with Kumu. It's called partial views. And I won't dive in now because it's like, I would argue the most complex feature that Kumu has. But for a use case like just changing colors, I actually have a video here where I did exactly that, because I think that is the most common use case for this feature, is setting up a view where you just have to click a button and the color scheme changes. And it's a super smooth reading experience for the user. They don't have to have any sort of Kumu expertise to know how to do that. They just click a button and it changes what, like if I wanted to, color, instead of coloring by tags, if I wanted to color this by something else, like I think all these organizations have a sector. If I wanted to color by sector, but I wanted my reader to be able to toggle to choose whether they want to color by tags or by sector, there is a way to put a button right on the screen that would say like color by tags, color by sector, and they just click one or the other and it flips the color scheme as they see fit. So yeah, definitely check out this partial views guide and watch that video because it should walk you through the exact steps to do just what you're talking about there. So Jim, question from Jim, if you have an image in the element, can you color a ring for the element? Color the ring, you mean adding flags or just like adding a color to the element itself?
Yeah, no, I guess flags is the concept I needed. So I think you showed that.
And then from Danilo, does Kumu pull map data from other places like Open Maps? Google Sheets is really like the only first-class integration I would say that we have, but you can bring in any remote data set if you check out this guide on blueprints. Basically, we have this like standard format in a file type called JSON. That's kind of like the format / file type that this is called. And we have a just like a standard format that you can use here. Any data that you format like this, no matter where it's coming from, you can import this into Kumu. And it's also, you know, usually pretty possible to host this stuff online. I think I even have, I have some instructions on here on how to, you know, get a JSON hosted online. So this would allow you to set something up. This is like kind of something we don't really see people do unless they are programmers or engineers themselves, or they have an IT team to help them set up just some basic software that would take data from one place, reformat it like this, and then just make it available somewhere where Kumu can find it. And so cool that people have been able to do stuff like that because it's just a generic format that, you know, you can put any data into. But yeah, again, it does take some engineering expertise, I think, to get that set up in a really smooth way. Like if you want to just if you're doing it more than once, basically, if you're kind of pulling data on an ongoing basis from somewhere and you want that to just show up in Kumu without any additional work from you, you would basically have to build some separate software. It wouldn't have to be anything too crazy, but some separate software would have to collect that data and format it for you.
Thanks. That's nice to know, but I actually meant, so when you put a zip code or something on a geolocation layout, how does Kumu know?
Oh yeah, how does it know? Yeah, so we have we use a geolocation service, basically that Kumu just sends all the locations to that service, and they send us back the latitude and longitude. And then if you just load latitude and longitude in, Kumu will just use that. But yeah, since we're using that X and Y coordinate behind the scenes, we have to have something that maps to that. And for Geo Maps, that is latitude and longitude. So if you just put in an address, we send that out to a service, they send us the coordinates, and then we can draw and plot the circle where it's supposed to go.
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
Yep. And order of operations for decorations in the advanced editor. That is a good topic. There is something called, we just call it the cascade, pulling vocabulary from another web technology that's similar. But basically, there's a demo in this decorate guide of how that works. Essentially, it works top to bottom, and anything on the bottom will override stuff on the top. So this is showing it with the basic editor, but in the advanced editor, this is actually, you know, taking this block of code, moving it below that one, this block of code, moving it below that one. So whichever one is on the bottom is the one that actually, you know, determines what happens on the map.
And do you have to sort of watch the nesting so that you know, you're in a nested set of elements, and so it uses that order rule that you just showed. But if I'm outside of that nest and I have another set of decorations, do you know what I'm saying? Or
I think the term that comes to mind for me is specificity.
Okay.
but yeah, so here in my advanced editor, I've got this rule, element label equals fourth element. That is very specific. It's more specific than if I just say element, whatever, all elements. This is a selector that is telling Kumu to change the color for all elements. You can see, even though this is, you know, less specific, it still changes the color. So no matter, we don't watch specificity. In CSS, which is what all this is based on, it would work where like this one would be more specific. So it would apply this rule, but in Kumu, we don't watch that. We just, you know, watch whatever's last. So a more generic rule saying all elements, and a more specific rule saying specifically the element whose label is fourth element, the all elements rule would override that just because it's below. And if I move this one below, it would then change that color back to that purple, I think it is. So yeah, that's how that works. I think that works in settings too. Like if I do template systems, yeah. So it'll, you know, I have got template radar thing there, and then since template systems is below it, that's the one that wins out. If I switch that back, yeah. So it works inside of blocks too. And if I do, yeah, like color red, that'll switch to red. So it's not just, you know, blocks themselves, it's actually inside of blocks what rules you're using. If you use the same rule more than once, the last one will win. And yeah, you can, if you have those rules available in the advanced editor, if I had more than one, I can drag and drop them like that to do basically the same thing. Behind the scenes, this is the same as, like, I have a rule that says all elements are blue or all elements are green. This is the exact same as copy pasting that code and putting it below the other code, and then copy pasting that code and putting it below the other code. But it's easier if you have them in the basic editor like that, obviously, because you can just drag and drop. And placement of drop downs, ooh, like controls, yeah. So if you want to have a control like that, well, I suppose I think I'll save that question maybe for a session on controls, because it's a little bit involved, but there is a way to do it. And you can actually go check out this view. I think I've got a view here that, yeah, it's no base styles, it's just the controls in here. So you can check out in the advanced editor. The only thing in here is my controls code. So you can look through that and possibly
Where do you
figure out
find
how I
that?
accomplished that one. Just dropped it in the chat, the link.
Oh, thank you.
I think that's public map, so you should be able to pull it up. But yeah, I've got some spacing and making sure the search is up top and that kind of thing. So, so I think we've covered a good amount of stuff. And just wanted to let you guys know that obviously I've been all over the docs on this call. So docs.kumu.io is something we're continually updating. You can always come in here to search through existing guides or read new guides, or tell us that we've made a typo, or tell us that something's completely wrong and we need to fix it. Or like Gene pointed out the other day, tell us that there's a feature missing from the doc, so we need to document it. And that one's in progress, Gene. And then if you really get stuck, just email us at support@kumu.io, or go to chat.kumu.io, and that will prompt you to join our public Slack group. And I'm in there all the time. Michelle, who also works with me at Kumu support, is in there all the time. And we have other members of the community. You can go in there also if you're not having trouble, if you're just like, you want to talk about systems or networks, or you know, share a map that you made recently, anything Kumu related. It's just kind of a general community chat room that, you know, happens to lean more toward troubleshooting, but you can put anything you want in there. If we see random advertisement stuff, like, you know, read my blog post about this totally unrelated topic, sometimes we'll go in and delete that stuff, but that's usually not an issue. Anything that's Kumu related or system and network related, you know, pretty wide range of content we're willing to entertain. That's just kind of a community space, and you guys can take ownership of it.